The air in the Lucky Strike saloon stilled as Victor Kane slammed his whiskey glass down on the worn wooden bar, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim. "Love don't last," he declared to anyone who would listen, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much heartbreak to believe otherwise. The year was 1878, and the small town of Red Rock, Arizona Territory, had heard this sentiment from the once legendary Cowboy more times than anyone cared to count. "You keep saying that, Vic," Sam the bartender said, wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "But I reckon you're still nursing that wound from 5 years back." Victor's weathered face hardened as he traced the rim of his glass with a calloused finger. At 32, the lines around his eyes told stories of harsh sun, hard work, and heartache. "Ain't no wound, Sam. Just the God's honest truth." The batwing doors of the saloon swung open, letting in a shaft of late afternoon sunlight that momentarily blinded the patrons. Victor didn't bother to look up, too focused on signaling Sam for another drink. But when the saloon fell unusually quiet, curiosity got the better of him. Standing in the doorway was a woman with copper hair swept up beneath a modest hat, wearing a travel-worn dress that nonetheless spoke of quality. Victor's glass froze halfway to his lips as recognition dawned on him like a cruel joke. Olivia Sinclair, the woman who had left Red Rock and him 5 years ago without so much as a proper goodbye. "I'm looking for Victor Kane," she announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands that only Victor seemed to notice. "Well," Sam whispered, low enough for only Victor to hear. "Seems like your past just caught up with you." Victor set his glass down carefully, as if the smallest wrong move might shatter more than just the glass. "What are you doing here, Olivia?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Her green eyes found his across the room, and for a moment, it was as if the 5 years between them had compressed into a heartbeat. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Privately." The other patrons watched with undisguised interest as Victor stood, dropped a coin on the bar, and walked toward the woman who had once been the center of his world. Without a word, he gestured toward the door, and she stepped back outside. He followed, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the dusty main street in hues of gold and amber. Olivia stood with her back to him, her shoulders set in a way that suggested she was steeling herself for something difficult. 5 years without a word, Victor said, breaking the silence. "And now you just show up?" She turned to face him, and he was struck by how she'd changed. The carefree girl he'd known had been replaced by a woman with purpose in her eyes and confidence in her stance. Yet there was something familiar in the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that made his chest ache with memories. "I had my reasons for leaving, Vic," she said softly. "Good ones. Must have been real good to walk away from what we had." A hint of pain flashed across her face. "I didn't come here to rake up the past. I came because I need your help." Victor laughed, though there was no humor in it. "My help? That's rich, Liv. What could I possibly help you with now?" She took a deep breath. "My father's ranch is in trouble. Men are trying to force him off his land, Harrington's men." The name sent a chill down Victor's spine. Thomas Harrington was the wealthiest man in the territory, with a reputation for ruthlessness that preceded him. "Your father's place is 3 days' ride from here. Why come to me?" "Surely your husband." "I'm not married, Vic," she cut him off. "Never was." The news hit him harder than he expected. For years, he'd pictured her in a fine house in San Francisco, married to the wealthy businessman she'd left to meet. The man who could give her everything Victor couldn't. "Your father has hands," Victor said, struggling to maintain his composure. "Had," she corrected. "Most left when Harrington started making threats. The few who stayed were beaten badly last week. Pa's too stubborn to leave, and her voice faltered for the first time. "I have nowhere else to go." Victor studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. "Why me, Olivia?" After all this time? Because you're the only man I know who's as stubborn as my father, she said with a ghost of a smile. And because you know that land as well as anyone. You helped build half the fences on that property. Before he could respond, two riders thundered down the main street, pulling up sharply in front of the saloon. Victor recognized them as Harrington's men, the kind who wore their guns low and were quick to use them. Their eyes settled on Olivia with a look that made Victor's blood boil. Well, the taller of the two said, dismounting. If it ain't Miss Sinclair. Your daddy sent you to beg for mercy? Victor stepped between Olivia and the men before he even realized what he was doing. The lady's not looking for trouble, he said evenly. The second man sneered. Ain't about what she's looking for. It's about what Mr. Harrington wants. And he wants that land. Then he should make a fair offer, Victor replied. The men exchanged amused glances.
He did.
Old man Sinclair's just too foolish to take it. The taller man's hand hovered near his holster. Maybe you should mind your own business, cowboy. Victor felt rather than saw Olivia tense behind him. I'm making it my business, he said, his voice deadly calm. The atmosphere crackled with tension until Sheriff Mills emerged from his office down the street, drawn by the commotion. Everything all right here? He called. The men reluctantly backed down. Just passing through, Sheriff, the taller one said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. He looked at Olivia. Tell your father he's running out of time. As they rode off, Victor turned to Olivia. Looks like you brought trouble with you. I didn't mean to involve you, she said, genuine regret in her voice. Victor sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. Too late for that. He glanced at the setting sun. It's too late to head out today. We'll leave at first light. Surprise and relief washed over her face. You'll help. I'll help your father, he clarified. Then we're square. Whatever was between us is in the past, and that's where it stays. The hurt that flashed in her eyes was quickly masked. Thank you, Vic. That's all I'm asking for. But as they made arrangements for the journey, Victor couldn't help but wonder if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Love don't last, he reminded himself. And Olivia Sinclair had already proven that once. The morning dawned crisp and clear as Victor led two saddled horses to the small boarding house where Olivia had spent the night. She emerged wearing riding clothes, practical pants beneath a split skirt, a sturdy jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her face from the sun. The outfit was a stark contrast to the fashionable dress she'd worn the previous day. You still remember how to ride? Victor asked, handing her the reins to a chestnut mare. Olivia took them with a confidence that answered his question. Some things you don't forget, she replied, mounting in one fluid motion. They set out as the town was just beginning to stir, heading southeast toward the Sinclair ranch. The first few hours passed in tense silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The terrain gradually changed from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional twisted juniper. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. They stopped by a small creek to rest the horses and eat some of the provisions Victor had packed. So, Victor finally said as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood, what happened in San Francisco? Olivia looked up, surprise evident in her expression. I never made it to San Francisco. It was Victor's turn to be surprised. But your letter said I was leaving to meet Mr. Hollister, I know. She sighed, picking at the hardtack in her hand. I got as far as Tucson before I learned the truth about him. He wasn't the respectable businessman he claimed to be. He was married with 3 children in Sacramento. Victor felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at the man who had lied to her, relief that she hadn't married him, and confusion about where she'd been all this time. Why didn't you come back? Olivia looked away, focusing on the rippling water of the creek. Pride, mostly. Everyone in town knew I was leaving to marry into wealth. How could I return and admit I'd been fooled? That the grand future I'd chosen over? She trailed off. Over what we had, Victor finished for her. She nodded slowly. I went to my aunt's place in Colorado instead. Took a job as a schoolteacher. It was a quiet life, but it was mine. She paused. I only came back when I received a letter from Pa saying he was in trouble. Victor absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the story he'd told himself for years. You could have written, "Let me know you were all right." Would you have wanted to hear from me? She challenged. He couldn't answer honestly, so he didn't answer at all. Instead, he stood and began preparing to continue their journey. We should keep moving if we want to reach Miller's Creek by nightfall. They rode in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence, now less hostile, more thoughtful. The landscape became increasingly familiar to Victor, stirring memories he'd tried to bury. Over that ridge was where they'd once watched a meteor shower, lying on a blanket beneath the vast canopy of stars. Near that outcropping of rocks was where he'd first told her he loved her, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. As the sun began its descent, they reached Miller's Creek, a popular stopping point for travelers. A small trading post and stables offered basic accommodations, and Victor arranged for 2 separate rooms. The proprietor, an elderly man named Miller himself, recognized Victor immediately. "Kane, been years since you passed through. And with a lady friend, no less." "She's not," Victor began, but Miller was already turning to Olivia with a warm smile. "You picked a good one, miss. This fella saved my grandson from drowning in the creek 3 summers back. Never asked for nothing in return." Olivia glanced at Victor with newfound curiosity. "Is that so?" Victor shifted uncomfortably. The boy just got in over his head. Anyone would have done the same. "Not anyone," Miller said, patting Victor on the shoulder. "Now, you two must be hungry. The wife's got stew on." Over dinner, Miller regaled Olivia with stories of Victor's exploits since she'd been gone, how he'd tracked down a gang that had been rustling cattle from small ranchers, how he'd helped organize the town's defense during a particularly bad drought when desperation drove men to violence. "Sounds like you've been busy," Olivia said when they were alone again, sitting on the porch as night fell. Victor shrugged. "Just doing what needed doing." "That's always been your way," she said softly. After a moment she added, "I'm sorry, Vic, for leaving the way I did." He wanted to hold on to his anger, but sitting there with her in the growing darkness, it was becoming harder to remember why. Why him? He asked, the question that had haunted him for years finally escaping. Why choose a stranger over what we had? Olivia was quiet for so long that Victor thought she might not answer. "I was 22, she finally said. "You were 27. We'd been together 3 years, and you never once mentioned marriage or a future beyond the next season." She looked at him. Hollister offered certainty. A fine house, financial security, a position in society. Things I thought I wanted. "I was saving," Victor said defensively. "Working extra jobs, putting money aside. I wanted to have something to offer you. I never needed wealth, Vic. Just a promise that we were building towards something together." She stood, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. "It doesn't matter now. We've both moved on." As she turned to go inside, Victor found himself saying, "I bought land. After you left. 100 acres west of town with good water rights. Built a house, too." She paused, half turned toward him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it was always for you," he admitted. "Even after you were gone, I couldn't stop building the future I'd planned for us." Their eyes met in the dim light, and for a moment, Victor saw a flicker of what might have been. Then Olivia broke the connection, murmuring a quiet goodnight before disappearing into her room. Victor remained on the porch long after she'd gone, watching the stars emerge and wondering how, after 5 years of convincing himself he was over her, one day in her presence could unravel it all. The next 2 days of travel brought them closer to the Sinclair ranch and, despite Victor's best efforts, closer to each other. They fell into a rhythm of shared tasks and easy conversation that reminded him of their past together. Olivia told him about her time as a teacher, the children she'd grown fond of, the quiet life she'd built. Victor shared stories of Red Rock, the changes in the town, the people who had come and gone. What neither of them spoke of was the tension that simmered beneath the surface, the lingering glances, the way their hands sometimes brushed as they passed items between them, the unfinished conversations that hung in the air. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a rise and saw the Sinclair ranch spread out before them in the valley below. Even from a distance, Victor could tell something was wrong. The fields that should have been dotted with cattle were eerily empty, and smoke rose from what appeared to be a burned-out structure near the main house. "Pa," Olivia whispered, spurring her horse into a gallop before Victor could stop her. He raced after her, keeping an eye on their surroundings as they thundered down toward the ranch. The smoke was coming from the remains of a barn, the charred timbers still smoldering. The main house stood intact, but several windows were broken, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges.
"Pa!"
Olivia called as she dismounted and rushed toward the house.
"Pa!"
An older man emerged from the doorway, rifle in hand. James Sinclair had aged considerably since Victor had last seen him, his once robust frame now thinner, his hair completely gray. His weathered face broke into relief at the sight of his daughter. "Olivia," he said, lowering the rifle and opening his arms. As she rushed into his embrace, his gaze settled on Victor over her shoulder, surprise and something like wariness crossing his features.
"Kane.
"Didn't expect to see you again." "He came to help, Pa," Olivia explained, pulling back to examine a cut above her father's eye. "What happened here?" James's expression darkened. "Harrington's men came 2 days ago, burned the barn, ran off the last of the cattle. Said next time it would be the house, with me in it." Victor surveyed the damage, anger building in his chest. "Where are your hands?"
"Gone."
"The 2 who stayed loyal took bad beatings. Sent them to town for the doctor." James shook his head. "I told them not to come back. No sense in them dying for my stubbornness." Olivia led her father back inside, and Victor followed after securing the horses. The interior of the house was in disarray, furniture overturned, a shelf of dishes shattered on the floor, papers strewn about. James settled heavily into a chair while Olivia began cleaning up. "Why does Harrington want your land so badly?" Victor asked, helping right a toppled table. James exchanged a look with his daughter before answering. "Railroads coming through. They're surveying for a route, and my property stands between Harrington's holdings and the proposed line. If he controls this land, he controls access to the railroad for the whole valley." Understanding dawned on Victor, and the value of his property would double overnight. "Triple more like," James agreed grimly. "He offered to buy me out at half what this place is worth, knowing full well it'll be 10 times that once the railroad comes." Victor moved to the window, scanning the horizon. "How many men does he have?" 6, usually. More if he thinks he needs them. "And they'll be back?" James nodded solemnly. "Said they'd give me one more chance to sign over the deed. They're coming tomorrow." The 3 of them spent the remainder of the day preparing as best they could. Victor repaired the front door and boarded up the broken windows. Olivia cleaned the house and prepared a proper meal from what supplies remained. James checked and cleaned his firearms, laying them out on the kitchen table with a methodical precision that spoke of his military past. As night fell, they gathered around the table to eat and discuss strategy. The plan was simple but risky. James would appear to be alone when Harrington's men arrived, while Victor would position himself for an ambush if things turned violent. Olivia would be hidden in the root cellar, armed with her father's old service revolver. "I should be up here with you," she argued. "I can shoot." "I know you can," James said gently. "But if something happens to both of us, someone needs to make it to town and bring the law back. You're the only one who can testify to what Harrington's been doing." She reluctantly agreed, though Victor could see she was far from satisfied with the arrangement. After dinner, James retired early, leaving Victor and Olivia alone in the kitchen. She stood at the wash basin, cleaning the dishes with quick, efficient movements that betrayed her anxiety. "We'll protect him," Victor said, coming to stand beside her. "I won't let anything happen to your father." She nodded, not looking up from her task. "I know. It's just—" Her hands stilled. "I've already lost so much time with him. The thought of losing him completely." Without thinking, Victor reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so familiar it made his heart ache. "That's not going to happen. Not while I'm here." She finally looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why did you really come, Vic? After everything that happened between us, you could have told me to find help elsewhere." The question hung between them, demanding an honesty Victor wasn't sure he was ready to give. But looking at her now, in the soft glow of the lamplight, he found he couldn't lie not to her, not to himself. "Because despite everything," he said quietly, "despite telling myself and anyone who would listen that love don't last, I never stopped loving you, Liv." The admission seemed to hang in the air between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Olivia's expression softened, vulnerability replacing the careful guard she'd maintained since her return. "I told myself I was doing the right thing," she whispered. "That leaving was best for both of us. But I've regretted it every day since." Victor's heart hammered in his chest as he stepped closer to her. "Why didn't you ever come back?" "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you'd hate me for leaving. Afraid you'd moved on. Afraid the love I remembered wasn't real." "It was real," he assured her, his voice rough with emotion. "It still is." The space between them seemed to vanish as he leaned down and she rose up, their lips meeting in a kiss that held 5 years of longing, regret, and unspoken words. Her hands gripped his shirt as if afraid he might disappear, while his cradled her face with a gentleness that belied his strength. When they finally broke apart, breathless and overwhelmed, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he said, "when your father's safe and Harrington's no longer a threat, come home with me, Liv. See the house I built, the land that's waiting for us." Hope bloomed in her eyes. "Are you asking me to stay this time?" "I'm asking you to marry me," he clarified. "I should have asked 5 years ago." Her answer was another kiss, fiercer than the first, full of promise and certainty. It was a moment of perfect happiness in the eye of the storm they knew was coming. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They took their positions early, anticipating Harrington's men would arrive with the sun. Victor concealed himself in the remains of the barn, rifle at the ready, while James sat openly on the front porch, appearing relaxed despite the shotgun across his lap. Olivia, after a final protest, descended into the root cellar, the trapdoor hidden beneath a rug in the kitchen. The riders appeared just after 9, a group of 7 men led by Thomas Harrington himself, a surprise development that changed their calculations. Harrington was in his 50s, expensively dressed and sitting his horse with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Sinclair," he called out as they approached. "I see you're still being stubborn." James didn't rise from his chair. "It's my land, Harrington. Not for sale at any price." Harrington dismounted, flanked by 2 of his men while the others remained on horseback. "Every man has his price. You're just too foolish to recognize yours." He glanced around the property, taking in the burned barn and the general disrepair. "Where's that pretty daughter of yours?" "I heard she was back." The question sent a chill through Victor. He hadn't anticipated Harrington's interest in Olivia. "She's gone to town," James lied smoothly. "Bringing back the sheriff. Should be here any time now." Harrington laughed. "Sheriff Dixon? He knows better than to interfere in my business." He took a step closer to the porch. "Last chance, Sinclair. Take my offer, or I can't be responsible for what happens next. James stood slowly, shotgun held casually but ready. I think you should leave my property. The tension crackled in the air as Harrington's face hardened. He nodded to his men, who began to spread out around the house. It was the moment Victor had been waiting for. He took careful aim at the ground near Harrington's feet and fired. The shot kicked up dirt inches from Harrington's polished boots, causing him to jump back in alarm. The men went for their guns as Victor emerged from his hiding place, rifle trained on Harrington. Next one won't miss, he called out, moving steadily toward the house. Harrington's eyes narrowed.
Kane.
Should have known you'd be mixed up in this. He turned to his men. There's only 2 of them. Take them. What happened next was chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Victor dove for cover behind a water trough. James fired both barrels of his shotgun, forcing Harrington and his closest men to scramble for safety. Victor managed to hit one of the mounted men, sending him tumbling from his horse. But they were still outnumbered, and Harrington's men were using the opportunity to surround the house. Victor saw 2 of them disappear around the back and felt a surge of fear. They were too close to where Olivia was hidden. He fought his way toward the house, exchanging fire with Harrington's men as he went. James provided covering fire from the porch until a bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing through the front door. James! Victor shouted, redoubling his efforts to reach the house. He made it to the porch, dragging James further inside, and checking his wound. It was bleeding heavily but didn't appear fatal. Stay down, he ordered, propping the older man against the wall. A crash from the kitchen sent Victor running through the house, arriving just in time to see the trapdoor to the root cellar being wrenched open. Without hesitation, he fired, hitting the man who had discovered Olivia's hiding place. The second man whirled, firing wildly in Victor's direction. A searing pain tore through Victor's side, but he managed to stay on his feet long enough to return fire, dropping the second intruder.
Beat.
Olivia emerged from the cellar, eyes wide with fear as she saw the blood spreading across his shirt. Your father's hit too, he gasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. Front room. She helped him to where James was slumped against the wall, his face pale, but his eyes alert. Outside, the gunfire had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more threatening. How many left? James asked through gritted teeth. At least 4, including Harrington, Victor replied, checking his ammunition. They're regrouping. Olivia tore strips from her petticoat to bind both men's wounds. We need to get you both to a doctor. Before either could respond, Harrington's voice called out from outside. You've got 2 dead men in there already, Sinclair. Come out now, or we burn the house down around you. Victor exchanged a grim look with James. They were running out of options. The older man nodded toward a small box on the mantelpiece. Deed's in there, he said quietly. If anything happens to me, it's yours, Olivia. Don't let Harrington get his hands on it. Nothing's happening to you, she insisted, though her voice trembled. Victor was calculating their chances when the distinctive sound of multiple horses approaching at speed drew everyone's attention. Through the window, he could see a cloud of dust on the road leading to the ranch. Reinforcements. James wondered aloud. But as the riders came into view, Victor recognized Sheriff Mills from Red Rock at their head, alongside several other men he knew, ranchers and townsfolk who had made the journey with extraordinary speed. Looks like someone sent for help after all, Victor said, a wave of relief washing over him. Outside, Harrington and his remaining men were now caught between the house and the approaching posse. They hesitated for just a moment before making a break for their horses. Shots rang out as the sheriff's men closed in, and 2 more of Harrington's men fell. Harrington himself made it to his horse and spurred it into a gallop, trying to escape across the open fields. Sheriff Mills personally pursued him, the 2 figures growing smaller in the distance until a final exchange of gunfire ended with only one rider returning. The aftermath was a blur of activity. The doctor who had accompanied the posse tended to Victor and James's wounds, declaring both would recover with proper rest. Sheriff Mills explained that word had reached Red Rock about Harrington's plans. One of the ranch hands Olivia had sent away had ridden straight through to alert the authorities. Mills had gathered as many men as he could and ridden hard to reach the Sinclair ranch in time. As for Harrington, he hadn't survived his encounter with the sheriff. His remaining men were taken into custody, and with the evidence provided by James and the ranch hands, they would face justice for their crimes. By evening, the house was quiet again. James had been moved to his bedroom to rest, while Victor sat on the front porch, his bandaged torso protesting every movement. Olivia joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Pa's finally sleeping," she said, handing him a cup before settling beside him on the bench. "Doctor says he'll be just fine with time." Victor nodded, relief evident in his expression. "And the ranch?" "Sheriff Mills says the Railroad Commission already rejected Harrington's proposed route. They're planning to run the line 5 miles east anyway." She shook her head. All this violence for nothing. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the landscape in golds and purples. Victor was acutely aware of Olivia beside him, of the second chance they'd been given that had almost slipped away again in a hail of bullets. "I meant what I said last night," he said finally, "about wanting you to come back with me, to see the place I built." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "And I meant my answer. But things are different now. Pa needs me, at least until he's recovered." Victor reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I can wait. I've waited 5 years already. A few more months won't kill me." A smile curved her lips. "Actually, I was thinking, that house of yours, is it big enough for 3? Understanding dawned on him. "You want her father to come with us? He's got no reason to stay here anymore. The ranch is too much for him to manage alone, and there's too many bad memories now." She squeezed his hand. "But I won't go anywhere without him." "Of course he can come," Victor said without hesitation. "There's plenty of room, and the town could use a man with his experience." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, Vic. Anything for you, Liv," he said softly. "Always has been." She leaned against him, careful of his injury. "So much lost time," she murmured. "Not lost," he corrected. "Just a detour on the way to where we were always meant to be." 6 months later, Victor stood on the porch of his house, their house now, watching a wagon approach along the road. The property had transformed since Olivia and James had moved in. The once sparse yard now boasted a garden. The interior had been brightened with curtains and comfortable furnishings, and the sound of laughter had replaced the lonely silence. James had settled into town life surprisingly well, becoming something of an advisor to younger ranchers and finding purpose in sharing his lifetime of knowledge. His shoulder had healed cleanly, and though he claimed it ached when rain was coming, it didn't stop him from being active around the property. As for Victor and Olivia, they had been married 3 months prior in a simple ceremony attended by what seemed like the entire town. The bitterness and hurt of the past had faded, replaced by a deeper, more mature love built on hard-won understanding and forgiveness. The wagon drew closer, and Victor smiled as he recognized Sam from the saloon at the reins. Beside him sat Olivia, returning from town with supplies. Her face lit up when she saw Victor waiting, and she waved enthusiastically. As Sam helped her down from the wagon, Victor noticed something different about the way she moved, in new carefulness, a protective hand that briefly touched her stomach before she caught herself and looked up to see if he had noticed. Their eyes met, and in that moment he knew. Joy unlike anything he'd ever experienced welled up inside him as he crossed the yard in long strides to meet her. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. A blush colored her cheeks. "Tonight. I wanted to be sure first." She took his hand and placed it gently against her still, flat stomach. Doctor says early spring. Victor pulled her close, overwhelmed by the perfection of this moment, this life they were building together. I love you, he whispered against her hair. More than I ever thought possible. I know, she replied, her voice filled with the same wonder. Turns out love does last after all. And as the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed their separation and reunion, Victor Kane, who had once declared that love don't last, held his future in his arms and silently thanked whatever fate had brought Olivia walking back through his door.